For this portion of the program, I'm playing two roles. I'm not just the MC, I'm also sort of running this panel, and I wanted to explain briefly. This one will be different than the one you just did. We have two MIT researchers, faculty members and researchers who will speak to us. Each will speak for 10 or 15 minutes. We're loose on that. And then I'm going to bring them both up with me afterwards to take your questions, both from here in the room and from the live stream. Again, if you haven't used Pigeonhole, that's a good thing to start using. Although based on the questions from the last panel and the talk, I think you all know Pigeonhole very well. So I hope that we can be as flooded with great questions as we were then. One of the reasons that we want to talk about sustainability from the disruption standpoint is I think we saw at the last COP in November in Glasgow that corporations like you, manufacturing corporations, are ahead of governments right now in terms of making commitments to get to net zero. Many of you know how you're going to do that. Many of you have no idea. Many of you are also somewhere in the middle. And so we wanted to talk today really about what we've seen from corporates in manufacturing and how they're dealing with sustainability, and also maybe provide you with some insights and tools on how you can chart your course to get there. The first brief talk will be from MIT research scientist Emre Gençer from the MIT Energy Initiative. He'll be talking to you about the tool that he's developing that can help you get to sustainability. Emre, please.
Thank you, Ron. Thank you for inviting to speak here. So I will start with a disruption first, a spin on the name of the talk. So the panel session is like corporate sustainability imperative, disruption or opportunity. But I think we should first ask another question. How do we quantify sustainability? Do we have the right tools, right capabilities to do so? So I will speak about a tool that we've been developing over the last couple of years. And especially I want to show you on the manufacturing side, we have a big challenge. And I will try to give you our perspective about this. So I will start with a couple of key questions. What are we trying to do at MIT Energy Initiative and why these are important? First of all, I think everybody agrees that we need decarbonization and to mitigate climate change effects. But we also need to make sure that all these solutions are economically feasible. And also, we really need to understand the role of manufacturing and industrial decarbonization in the deep decarbonization we are talking about. So everybody is committing net zero by 2030, 2040, 2050. And we really don't know whether this is feasible or not, both technologically and economically. The second important point here is basically what sectors we need to go after first and what technology options we can implement. And here, one of the challenges is basically there's a pairing between technologies and pathways to decarbonize. And the time is also quite important because achieving net zero is our goal, but how we go there makes a huge difference because ultimately cumulative emissions makes the impact in terms of climate change. Also, we have the opportunity part of this is basically based on how we decarbonize, what technologies we implement, we can shape the demand in a way that it will be beneficial for water impact, power generation impact, emission impact, so on and so forth. I will give very brief examples from these, but hopefully in the Q&A we can address more of these. And also, the main topic that I am really working on is this multi-sector dimension. So there is a sector coupling happening, and can we really benefit from this sector coupling in our decarbonization pathways? Instead of just working on a standalone, isolated way, our processes, if we integrate the entire economy, is there an opportunity? So I'm coming from the MIT Energy Initiative, and of course the core of what I do is energy related. And what we see today in the energy space is basically a huge convergence of subsectors of energy. These are power, industry, building, and transportation. there are many links that you can see here. The electrification of transportation is one of the examples that is really developed. So with all our Teslas and other EV vehicles, we really introduce a huge load on the power grid. In the meantime, we need to invest on the infrastructure to be able to charge our vehicles at different times, so on and so forth. Similar next challenge will be about hydrogen. I am sure you are hearing a lot about like green hydrogen, different colors of hydrogen, and how they will be incorporated in our economy. And there will be other challenges coming up here as well. So here I listed 5 points about the decarbonization of industry and manufacturing. Electrification as the first strategy that we kind of accepted, using hydrogen, making sure that the manufacturing piece is decarbonized, using carbon capture, utilization, and storage, and finally, system integration. So one of the points that I want to make is about how we build our system boundaries. Because if you have a system boundary based on your manufacturing site, one single vehicle, so on and so forth, decarbonization is not really a challenge. So here the idea is to bring together scope 1, 2, and 3 emissions. And for those of you who don't know, scope 1 emissions are your direct emissions when you do manufacturing. Scope 2 emissions are the indirect emissions because of using power or using other resources, so on and so forth. And scope 3 are the emissions that happens because of the end use. So one example here in the transportation sector is basically we have multiple pathways, as you can see, and ultimately we are trying to achieve decarbonization of passenger vehicles and heavy-duty vehicles. And here, all the gray arrows represent different emission sources. And when we think about like decarbonization, if we are only focusing on passenger vehicles, then electric vehicles will solve the problem. There are no tailpipe emissions, then there is no emission. But it is not the real story, because how we produce electricity will determine whether this is an emission-free, net zero pathway or not. And similarly, for hydrogen fuel cell electric vehicles will only emit water vapor. But if we are producing hydrogen from natural gas or coal, then actually our life cycle emissions are not zero. So here the idea is, for decarbonization perspective, we need to bring life cycle emissions into the picture, and we need to understand the impact of scope 1, 2, and 3 emissions. But how we draw the boundary will be determined mostly by regulations. So the tool that we've been developing, called Sesame, is short for Sustainable Energy Systems Analysis Modeling Environment. It is a scenario analysis tool to compare and assess different technology options, different regulations, to understand the impact in terms of overall emissions, overall cost, and system dynamics. Also, we are representing all the 4 sectors that I have mentioned in the Venn diagram in my opening slide. We have all these 4 sectors, and also we are looking at the sector coupling between these two, how they impact. So one obvious question that we all have is like on the electrification side. So if we are increasing electric vehicles, electrification in industry, how this will impact power grid, especially as we have more renewables. As we know, it is an intermittently available resource. If we don't have energy storage in the system, then we might have hard time operating our plants or charging our vehicles. So I will give you 2 examples that are relevant from manufacturing perspective. The first one is from transportation. And here, this is a report that we published a couple of years ago on the mobility of the future. So what will be the future of passenger vehicles and how we can decarbonize. And my team performed the life cycle assessment for the report. And here, this graph summarizes the life cycle emissions of 4 different powertrain options: internal combustion engine vehicles, hybrid electric vehicles, plug-in hybrid electric vehicles, and hydrogen fuel cell electric vehicles. All the blues are different hydrogen options. And the other ones is black is internal combustion engine, red is hybrid, and green is battery electric vehicle. So there are 2 points I want to make here. The first one is, as you can see, blue can be anywhere, depending on how we produce hydrogen. So basically, the production of hydrogen plays a huge role in the decarbonization we achieve in passenger vehicles. And I'm not promoting hydrogen fuel cell electric vehicles here, but it can be the most emitting option if we are using grid electricity with electrolyzers, or it can be the least emitting option if we are using a dedicated wind plant with electrolyzers. So all these colors of hydrogen are actually really not necessarily mean anything unless we really understand the assumptions that goes in, how it's produced, so on and so forth. But the second piece I want to make sure that we see here is that with wind power using electrolyzers, the emissions in 2050 don't go to zero. As you can see, so we still have some emissions, approximately 60 grams per mile driven. And this is purely coming from manufacturing, because even though we have completely decarbonized the power generation and we are using electrolyzers for hydrogen manufacturing, if we have not decarbonized manufacturing, you need to manufacture vehicles, you need to manufacture wind turbines, electrolyzers, and all of the carbons are building up to, in this case, 60 grams CO2 equivalent per mile. And this is mostly omitted in the discussions we are having about net zero future, because like everybody is trying to focus on the direct emissions, but they completely ignore the importance of manufacturing emissions. The second example I want to give is actually a zoom into this example from renewable power. As we know, renewable power has much lower emissions than natural gas or other fossil-based power generation options. And here, using our Sesame tool, I just created an example this morning. Solar PV installed in California, wind power installed in onshore wind installed in California, and natural gas power plants, combined cycle power plants. So we are comparing greenhouse gas emissions from all these three options throughout the life cycle. And as you can see, wind and solar are not emissions free, because we need to manufacture these turbines, install these turbines, recycle these PV units, so on and so forth. And of course, when you look at the comparison, there is a huge difference between what we get from natural gas power plants and these. But the point here is it's not carbon free. And let's look at the distribution of these emissions and run a quick sensitivity analysis. As you can see, the power emissions due to panel production has a huge impact on the overall emissions. And this is a clear example of why we need to focus on manufacturing more seriously, and why it will be really important to bring it to the discussion in decarbonization as soon as possible. And I'll stop here with this slide showing that actually we have created a quite complex structure in Sesame platform to be able to understand the entire supply chain. And in this particular topic, we will be focusing on the industrial or manufacturing decarbonization. And one of the challenges that we will be definitely looking into is power sector connection with industrial decarbonization. And looking forward to your questions in Q&A. Thank you.
That's a great stage setter, Emre. Thank you, and we'll welcome you back shortly. I think what Emre just told you is, as manufacturers, you're going to be left holding the bag in 2050. So hopefully we can help you kind of get started on that a little bit sooner. It is a very, very challenging problem, and mapping your way to zero is going to be critical. I'd like to bring up our next panelist and speaker, Professor Jacquelyn Pless of the MIT Sloan School of Management. I'm going to forget a word, and I apologize, but Jacquelyn is part of the Technology, Innovation, and Entrepreneurship in Management program. Did I get it right?
Very close. It was
right.
Strategic management.
Strategic management. I knew I would forget a word, and I'm very sorry about that, but we've had a back and forth, and Jacquelyn has done some work on sustainability in manufacturing that she'd like to talk to you about. I want to remind you too, get your questions in, because when Professor Pless is done, we're going to sit down and talk about all the questions that this is generating from you here and from you on the live stream. Jacquelyn, welcome.
Thank you. Okay, well, thank you all for being here. This is a very, very important topic, and so it's exciting to see this level of engagement and excitement here. I am going to be speaking a bit more on so Emre set me up extremely well for what I'm going to be speaking about now, which is a bit more on the economics and management and business side of things. First was kind of motivating a little bit as well on why this is so important, but really starting to focus then too on what are some of the actual kind of management practices and strategies that are or are not being implemented so far. And which ones do we know might have a little bit more of an impact than others when it comes to reducing emissions in the manufacturing sector. So just briefly to go through, I mean, starting back in 2015, before Glasgow, we had kind of the first big landmark international agreement, as I'm sure you all know, about 195 countries agreeing to reduce their greenhouse gas emissions. There were some targets that were set, some of which were industry-specific as well. And really what this did was kind of provide a broad framework for monitoring and reporting progress. It didn't set many very explicit ways of doing this. It did have a few different kind of, we're going to now require some type of reporting and things like that. But it was still left to be pretty broad. And so this opens some questions about, how do we consistently do this? How do we make sure that we're actually starting to implement these frameworks? And some of the targets we're supposed to be getting kind of progressively stronger over time here. And so the questions that we want to think about now is, climate policy has indeed been very uncertain over time. So I think this has historically kind of held us back from or some of the kind of investments that go into these types of changes. And it's great to see that on the private sector side, we have actually seen almost more engagement or more commitments that we necessarily see on the policy side, or at least we did until recently. So I just want to highlight, why really take it seriously now? Has it been taken seriously yet? How do we move forward? So the first is just, I think, again, something that we all kind of know, but just to highlight some numbers, that's that climate costs are real, right? This is just an example kind of broadly about how the cost of climate-related disasters, and this is thinking about the total economic costs, has increased by 150% over the last kind of 4 decades. And this, of course, also applies to the manufacturing sector. On the demand side, so we know that even if there aren't these policies that are implemented, there are kind of increasingly lots of strong and changing kind of dynamics on the consumer side with demanding change, right? People want to be consuming products that they think are produced sustainably. And so I think that on the policy and regulatory side, from my perspective, it's going to be much more kind of certain moving forward, or at least we think that there's going to be some of those commitments. And of course, this is not just happening in the public sphere. We have kind of this surge of interest and commitment on the investor side of things to kind of, or basically in divestment in the very dirty firms. And then kind of this ESG-led investing, so these indicators around environmental, social, and governance that investors use that evaluate all companies that help guide their investment decisions. Now, a lot of issues with these indicators that I'll talk about in a minute. And that's really going to be where some of my focus on kind of breaking those down, decomposing them to better understand what really works or doesn't. So I would say, despite like moving over or moving past the investment side, once we see actual companies starting to say that they commit to decarbonization, what does that really mean, right? So what are they actually doing? Are they doing what they say? Is this all just having some type of public perception to make sure that they are making people happy? Well, so this here is an example. So I'm going to be tying some things in from other people's research as well as mine. This here is a figure and some data that's been provided by this group called the Transition Pathway Initiative, which is based at the London School of Economics, where they basically they're deep diving into a set of companies, some of which might be represented here actually, and evaluating their kind of current status as well as their progress on both carbon emissions and kind of alignment with those Paris agreements, as well as management practices. So the quality of how they are actually implementing different processes and practices to achieve this. And so what this figure here is telling you is that despite the many, many different kind of expressed commitments, the progress so far has actually been it's been very small amounts of progress. And they're using here these benchmarks that have been set by the Paris Agreement to evaluate that. So we can see here that, so in the red just means that they're not aligned at all. The orange here is that they are not aligned at all to address their kind of emissions or environmental impact. The Paris pledges and kind of a 2-degree increase type of commitment are the orange and yellow. So we can see here the degree of what is kind of green here, the best type of strategy, is really quite low so far. So how do we start to think about actually executing or aligning our strategies to have a real impact? So the first is that this the same kind of initiative, as well as some of the emerging research out there, would say that you really need to have a well-defined target, plan, and strategy. So we increasingly see different companies having, say, these targets, even very explicitly quantitative targets on on what type of level to get to with their emissions. But the areas in which they're kind of less successful so far, and I'd be really excited to hear your thoughts and experiences on what's being implemented, is having a very explicit plan and strategy that's incorporated into the actual kind of overall strategy of the company, and then trickling down to different management practices that can help achieve those goals. And so as I had mentioned, a lot of companies and also investors use these kind of very broad aggregated indicators to try to assess how well they're doing. But within those ESG indicators, they're made up of something, well over 100 different questions that are self-reported. So it's really hard to know what exactly is driving any type of change. And so some of the research that I have underway, as well as some others, is trying to decompose those indicators to figure out what really matters or doesn't. And so just to give you an example now of how the transition pathway is actually starting to break this down and think about it, the first is on the carbon performance that I just mentioned. And then the second is on the quality of management, breaking down specific questions. So how does management quality performance today look? So what they did, they're gathering information on something like the top 300 or 400 companies in terms of size within these different industries, including energy, industrials, materials, things like that. And they have a different set of questions that they're pulling out that can kind of rate them on a scale from 0 to 4 on how well or how what types of practices are most aligned with what should achieve this outcome. Going from level 0, where it's just a company not recognizing any potential impact of climate change, up to as strongly as the strategic assessment type of thing. So it's having some type of long-term quantitative target, but also then incorporating the climate change performance into, say, executive pay and salaries, and creating these other incentives to actually implement beyond just setting a target. Okay, and what you can see here is that it's actually a pretty, we can think about 26% of these companies reaching level 4. I guess it's subjective in terms of how we interpret that number, but I would say that that's actually still pretty low. So just to give you an example of some of the questions that are being asked here around those management practices that might work or not, the top set of bars here is just what would be represented in, say, that lower level of 1 or 2 type of rating. And this is just asking, do you acknowledge that climate change is an issue for your company? Do you have emissions targets in some way? Is there some type of board member responsibility explicitly for these goals? And so this is where we do see many companies doing this, right? And I'm sure you all are doing it yourselves as well. And some of the areas in which would bring everybody up to level 4, where we see in the survey data not quite as much happening so far, is undertaking very explicit kind of climate scenario planning for your company to know, if you implement certain processes, what do you expect to happen? Are there some type of kind of risks and opportunities that are actually incorporated into the strategy and things of that nature? And this is where you can see that the red here being the no's, and those bars are much wider, right, for that much more kind of higher quality of management score. And I just want to highlight that sometimes I hear, I guess a lot less these days, but that environmental regulation and policy are at odds with firm performance and productivity. Of course, it imposes some additional costs. But historically, some of the research that looks at past environmental regulations that were actually quite stringent has shown that it might impose some costs, especially in the short run, but in the long run, it's actually driving lots of emissions, not just emissions reductions, but increases in output, increases in performance in the long run. So it really can kind of be a good strategy up front to be thinking about these things. So there's some evidence from Joe Shapiro and Reed Walker, who are at Berkeley, looking at this on the US side of things. And I have some work that's in the works at the moment that shows an environmental regulation in China had these positive effects on productivity in the long run too. And of course, this type of disruption also creates opportunities to innovate. So we might think about, in the manufacturing context, innovation in processes or in implementing these new business practices, and how that might impact environmental impact. It could be that you are producing a clean energy technology yourselves. We do need tons of innovation in this space, and so perhaps this is one of your main technologies, or that you're getting into it. But just to say that manufacturing is, of course, vital for building this low carbon economy and can play that role of innovating in these new technologies. And so I just to provide some examples of kind of how disruption did drive or does drive this type of innovation that I think is very relevant today. It feels a little uncomfortable, honestly, to be speaking about things like this, given the current crisis in Ukraine and the kind of tragedy and loss of human life around it. But in the context of today, this is another type of oil crisis that's on the horizon, where the US has pulled out from importing all oil from Russia. And there might be some talks of that happening across Europe as well, although probably less likely given their dependence on it. And here is where we think, okay, well, the US actually doesn't import all that much oil from Ukraine. So you might think, oh, this doesn't have a huge impact. Of course, all of these things are kind of inputs into the way that we operate. And so we might think it's not going to have that much of an impact on us, but this is a global market, right? So any type of pulling out is going to be impacting prices. If Europe pulls out, that'll be 3 million gallons-ish of oil out of Russia, or cut out of Russia exports. And so we can think about this driving up oil prices, which we've seen massively recently. And so this is just another area that will start to hopefully drive some innovation in this space. And so I just want to conclude now by saying, decarbonization isn't bad for business. I think that that's increasingly accepted. But what's really critical here is to actually develop, execute, and manage what we just call real strategies, right? Not just kind of making claims around what's happening to make consumers happy or to make investors happy, but actually starting to implement some of these new, or not even new, some of these more involved management practices along the way. And I will stop there. Thank you.
Jacquelyn, stay with us. Emre, please come and join us, and I'll make myself comfortable as well. We have a ton of fantastic questions. I just want to set the stage here. You didn't come to this conference for us to tell you that you have a problem. You come to us and tell us what your problems are, and I think that both of our speakers here have given you aspects of solution paths. Jacquelyn basically told you that you can't control what you can't measure, and we know how to measure some of these things, and there are things that you can do. Emre told you that, like all good managers, you want to do scenario analysis, and we have a tool at MIT that he is developing in his team that can help you do that scenario analysis. And I think that's a great lead into the first question, which got the most votes, which is in the discussion we've had so far, we haven't really talked about nuclear as a potential decarbonization option. Emre, I'll ask you that question first, and then I'll throw it to you as well, Jacquelyn.
Nothing personal, so I just focused on solar and wind for the example, but I totally believe that nuclear is part of the solution. And we are seeing now, actually, with the Ukrainian crisis, that there is a shortage of natural gas or potential shortage of natural gas in Europe, and some of the unintuitive policies that we are seeing, especially in Germany, for example, they, instead of just continuing using their nuclear power, they prefer to increase the power generation from coal power plants. To me, it doesn't really make any sense, and I truly believe that nuclear is part of the solution. And the reason I didn't include in the slides because I only have 10 minutes, but I promise next time I will have a nuclear slide.
And Jacquelyn, I'd ask you this question as well. You know, you talked a lot about how what corporations can be doing differently. Is there a corporate role in fostering the advent of nuclear power to decarbonize operations?
Yeah, that's a good point, and I'm now holding my mic, given how women's clothing rarely work for these things. So I would just kind of reinforce or echo what Emre just said. But also just to say that there is, some of the challenges around this are, of course, how do you deal with waste and things like that. So that even though it's a zero emissions kind of technology, there's still a lot of environmental impact. We're mining in places where, labor is being exploited, things like that. So there are some of those challenges, but then, what can we, and actually here at MIT, there is a really big effort on the fusion side of things that are looking to address a lot of those issues. And then on the, what can we do on the business side and the management side? I'd just say investors, right? This stuff is going to take massive amounts of investment, massive amounts of testing, and kind of the innovation that happens in the energy sector takes particularly long relative to many other contexts. It's kind of a very capital-intensive industry. And this is where we've seen the need for more patient capital beyond kind of venture capital where you expect money within 5 years. And so I would just say kind of more patient capital is going to be important.
That gives me a good opportunity to mention the Engine, our sort of MIT-invested organization that's doing exactly that. Commonwealth Fusion Systems, which is the fusion company that you're alluding to, is one of the Engine's investments. We don't have a lot of time. I could go more further, but I won't. The next question, Emre, this is an easy one. It's a softball, as they say, for you to do your business development. But is your tool available to use outside of MIT?
So we are currently working on creating an open access version that's like external people will also be used Sesame tool. But right now it will be mostly using publicly available data sources. So, but we are also looking for how we can make sure that this is more broadly adopted and it will be used with companies, so on and so forth. And if you have questions, please feel free to reach out to me. Yeah. I'm sure we can find a way to work together.
I'll tell you that as part of my role as a program director, I've connected several of my companies with Emre about doing proprietary modules within Sesame to help them do their job. So absolutely, that is a pathway. And your program director can help do that for you as well. A little plug for the program. The next question, how can consumers better assess the sustainability claims made by companies and distinguish greenwashing from legitimate practices? Jacquelyn, that is right up your alley, I think.
Yeah, absolutely. And especially on the consumer side, this is really difficult, right? Because even from the policy side and the investor side, the data it's really difficult to understand, to know what we can trust, what we can't trust. I would say that I think that there's, hopefully, at least there's talk of this, and I do think that data and methods are starting to help us do this better in terms of what policymakers can do, like requiring the reporting in different ways, and really monitoring and that type of oversight, and then publishing that information publicly will allow consumers to, this is more on like what would enable consumers as opposed to what they can do. But in terms of, say, even kind of monitoring and checking whether the reporting on emissions is accurate, there are efforts to do this. And it's still difficult with relying on some type of public resources, but increasingly on the data side, the academic side, and hopefully now in the industrial side, there's data from places like NASA, satellite data, that can be pretty accurate in getting down to, right now maybe not company specific, but in a way that can tie it to certain areas. And to me, that has great potential for verification, and then hopefully that turns into public communications too.
Can I follow up on that? Because those are some great observations. If you had 5 minutes with every major world political leader, what would you tell them that they need to do to get this kind of common accountability in place? What are they not thinking of right now?
So common account.
Just an easy question.
No. It's easy and it's not, because it's like, there's so many things I would like to say, and I would want to communicate them well. And even before getting to that, I would say, put a lot of money into R&D and innovation, but in the right places, and how investment is frequently more effective than divestment. But on the accountability side, I think just having very real reporting requirements is the first step. A lot of what's out there at the moment is voluntary, and I think that there's increasing kind of interest in doing that on the private sector side, just out of, again, trying to have a certain perception or create a certain perception, but just actually requiring that and monitoring it and publishing kind of more disaggregated information on who's doing well and not, rather than these indicators that are really kind of big black boxes. Right. That would be a good start.
Yeah, I'd love to dig into the slide that you showed with the numbers in green and yellow and red, but I'm sure the people who did the study aren't telling. Yeah. Emre, the next question is for you, and I think you answered this one, but let's just be sure. And to paraphrase it, is the embodied carbon in the components, for example, green transportation and other green constituents, is it included in your model and in your thinking?
Yeah, absolutely. We are including all of these in our model, but more importantly, I think the point I wanted to make, this needs to be included in all our discussions, because there is embedded carbon, there is the manufacturing piece, and nothing is free in terms of emissions as well. So like if we are taking a life cycle approach, then all of these will be part of our carbon accounting. And also I've seen many questions about we are not only looking at carbon, there are many other impacts, and I just focused on carbon in my examples as a easy target, but of course there are other environmental impacts that we need to take into account. Methane is one of them, and in our analysis we are not only looking at CO2, basically greenhouse gases include methane as well, and that's also adjusted with the global warming potential. But absolutely, so if there is additional emissions due to these switching to green technologies, that are part of what we do and how we quantify.
I'm going to jump down to the bottom. There's a question from Kevin Simon, which I think is really pertinent. Jacquelyn, can you tell us more about how increasing sustainability drove productivity improvements at the firms you're studying?
Yeah, absolutely. So in this context, the main kind of the first big driver was this regulation being imposed. Of course, any big kind of cost that's being imposed on you is going to start to drive some type of change if the compliance is enforced. So in certain contexts, enforcement from the start is a big challenge. But if it is enforced and there are these kind of extra costs that are imposed, so we weren't studying a carbon tax specifically, but an economist will always say that's kind of the ideal, optimal place to start. But if there's a regulation where it is being enforced and you need to continue to check in and monitor, then some of the productivity changes are coming out of process innovation, specifically in our context. These are not companies that are innovating in clean tech, but they are ones that are changing, their inputs and either reducing inputs or in some cases, for say the dirtiest firms, they're adopting new technologies that reduce emissions, and some of those processes, some of those investments actually result in kind of longer term performance improvements because you're using less in your processes. So that's what's driving our results.
Thank you. We're just about out of time, so reflecting what my colleague JJ did this morning, because he ran that panel so well, I just want to remind you that these resources are available to the world. MIT is an open university, and so what Professor Pless has studied, that research is available on her website. Obviously, what Dr. Gençer is doing on modeling is also available on the Sesame website. All of these links are there in the slides, which will be available to you. And again, not to beat the dead horse, but your program director at the ILP can absolutely help connect you with this. We have heard from our members, probably the #1 topic of interest from ILP members right now, manufacturing and otherwise, is sustainability. So we're here to help. And I thank both of you, our panelists. This was fantastic. I hope we can build some more connections with you in industry. And if your questions didn't get answered, please come and see them or email them. Sorry, I just opened you guys up for a lot of things.
That's perfect.
Thank you.
Thank you.